Pentagon's madhouse. The strangest weapons America used in Vietnam. Untold Vietnam Chronicles. Welcome back to Untold Vietnam Chronicles, where we dive into the stories that make you question everything you thought you knew about warfare. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most bizarre chapters in military history, a time when the Pentagon became convinced that the key to winning the Vietnam War wasn't better soldiers or smarter strategies, but weirder weapons. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button for more mind-blowing stories from Vietnam that sound too crazy to be true. Like this video if you want to discover how America spent billions of dollars on weapons that belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a real battlefield. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love hearing from our global community of history enthusiasts. Now buckle up, because tonight we're diving into Project Blue Book's rejected concepts, the Pentagon's secret weapon labs, and the absolutely bonkers arsenal that American forces actually deployed in the Vietnamese jungle. This is the story of how America's best and brightest minds created some of history's most spectacular military failures. Chapter 1: The Desperation Innovation. By 1967, it was becoming clear to Pentagon planners that conventional warfare wasn't working in Vietnam. The enemy didn't line up in neat formations to be destroyed by superior firepower. They hid in tunnels, melted into civilian populations, and fought a war that seemed to follow completely different rules than anything American military doctrine had prepared for. The response from Washington wasn't to fundamentally rethink strategy or tactics. Instead, it was to double down on American technological superiority by creating weapons so advanced, so revolutionary, so absolutely bizarre that they would give US forces an unbeatable advantage. This mindset led to the creation of DARPA's Special Operations Division, a classified research group tasked with developing unconventional warfare solutions for asymmetric conflict scenarios. In plain English, they were told to invent science fiction weapons that could win an unwinnable war. The budget was essentially unlimited. The timeline was immediate. The constraints were minimal. And the results were absolutely insane. Between 1967 and 1973, American forces deployed weapon systems that included explosive-tipped arrows fired from crossbows, chemical compounds designed to make enemy soldiers homosexual, mechanical elephants controlled by remote flying platforms, powered by human muscle, underground sensors that could detect footsteps from miles away, and weather control systems designed to create monsoons on demand. None of them worked the way they were supposed to. The story of these weapons isn't just about military failure. It's about what happens when brilliant minds are given unlimited resources and told to ignore the laws of physics, human nature, and common sense. It's about how desperation and hubris combined to create some of the most expensive boondoggles in military history. But more than that, it's about the soldiers who had to use these weapons in actual combat, often discovering in the worst possible moments that their cutting-edge equipment was more dangerous to themselves than to the enemy. Chapter 2: The People's Sniffer. The first and perhaps most famous of America's bizarre Vietnam weapons was the XM-3 Airborne Personnel Detector, better known as the People's Sniffer. The concept was elegantly simple: create a device that could detect human beings from the air by sensing their chemical emissions. The science behind it was sound. Humans emit distinctive chemical signatures: carbon dioxide from breathing, ammonia from sweat, various organic compounds from body odor. In theory, a sensitive enough detector could identify these signatures from a helicopter or airplane, and pinpoint enemy locations even when they were hidden under jungle canopy. General Electric was awarded a $20 million contract to develop the system, which consisted of a modified mass spectrometer mounted in a helicopter pod. The device could theoretically detect human chemical signatures from altitudes up to 1,000 feet, allowing pilots to locate enemy camps, supply routes, and troop concentrations without putting themselves at risk. The first field tests were promising. During controlled experiments at Fort Benning, Georgia, the People's Sniffer, successfully detected groups of soldiers hidden in wooded areas from distances that would have been impossible using visual observation alone. Pentagon officials were ecstatic. Finally, they had a technological solution to the problem of finding an invisible enemy. The system was deployed to Vietnam in March 19. Intelligence briefings predicted that the People Sniffer would revolutionize reconnaissance operations and allow American forces to locate Viet Cong camps with unprecedented precision. The reality was somewhat different. The first problem was that the Vietnamese jungle was full of people. The device couldn't distinguish between enemy soldiers and civilian farmers, between Viet Cong fighters and South Vietnamese allies, between humans and large animal, water buffalo, elephants, and even large groups of monkeys, all produced chemical signatures that the system interpreted as potential enemy forces. Captain James Rodriguez, who flew People Sniffer missions out of Tan Son Nhut Air Base, later described the frustration. The thing would go crazy every time we flew over a village, a farm, a herd of animals, or pretty much anywhere people actually live. We'd get readings that suggested massive enemy concentrations, but when we called in artillery or airstrikes, we'd find out we'd been bombing rice farmers or water buffalo. The second problem was that the Viet Cong quickly figured out how the system worked and developed countermeasures. They began using animal waste to mask human scents, positioning decoy camps near civilian areas to trigger false positives, and even creating fake chemical signatures using captured American supply. The third and most serious problem was that the system's sensitivity made it almost unusable in combat conditions. Engine exhaust from the helicopter, chemical residues from weapons and equipment, even the pilot's own body odor could overwhelm the sensors and produce meaningless reading. After 8 months of operations, the People Sniffer was quietly withdrawn from service. The official reason given was technical difficulties requiring further development. The unofficial reason was that it had never successfully identified a genuine enemy target that couldn't have been found more easily using conventional method. The $20 million investment had produced exactly 0 tactical advantages and had actually hindered operations by providing false intelligence that led to wasted resources and civilian casualty. Chapter 3: Agent Blue and the Homosexual Bomb. While the People Sniffer was failing to find the enemy, DARPA's Chemical Warfare Division was working on an even more ambitious project: chemical compounds that could alter enemy behavior and morale without causing permanent physical harm. The concept was based on emerging research in neuroscience and behavioral psychology. If scientists could identify the chemical pathways that controlled human behavior, they could theoretically develop compounds that would make enemy soldiers unable or unwilling to fight. The most notorious of these projects was codenamed Agent Blue, though it had nothing to do with the defoliant of the same name. This Agent Blue was designed to alter sexual behavior and social bonding patterns in enemy force. The theory, developed by Air Force researchers working with pharmaceutical companies, was that certain chemical compounds could disrupt normal testosterone production and increase estrogen-like effects in men exposed to. The goal wasn't to cause physical harm, but to create psychological and social disruption that would break down military discipline and unit cohesions. Dr. Margaret Hayes, a biochemist who worked on the project at Edgewood Arsenal, later wrote in her classified memoir, "The idea was that if you could alter sexual orientation and social bonding patterns in an enemy unit, you could destroy their effectiveness as a fighting force without causing permanent physical damage." It was supposed to be more humane than conventional weapons. The compound that was eventually developed was delivered via aerosol spray from aircraft or artillery shells. In laboratory tests, using primates, it produced measurable changes in social behavior and hierarchy pattern. Pentagon officials were convinced they had discovered a revolutionary new form of warfare. Field testing began in early 1968, with Agent Blue deployed in carefully controlled operations against suspected Viet Cong positions. The results were supposed to be evaluated through prisoner interrogation and behavioral observation of affected units. The problem was that the chemical had virtually no effect on actual combat performance. While laboratory tests suggested that the compound could alter social behavior under controlled conditions, the realities of combat stress, adrenaline, survival instinct, completely overwhelmed any subtle chemical effect. More seriously, the compound turned out to be highly toxic to plant life and could contaminate water supplies for months after deployment. Several American units were accidentally exposed during field operations, leading to a range of health problems that wouldn't be fully understood until decades later. The project was cancelled in 1969 after causing more problems for American forces than for the enemy. All remaining stockpiles were destroyed and the research files were classified at the highest levels. The official reason given for the cancellation was completion of research objective. The real reason was that the weapon had proven to be completely useless while creating potential public relations disasters and long-term health problems for American personnel. Chapter 4. The Mechanical Elephant Army. Perhaps the strangest weapon system developed for Vietnam was Project Dumbo, an attempt to create robotic elephants that could carry supplies and equipment through jungle terrain that was impassable for conventional vehicles. The concept originated with a DARPA engineer named Dr. Robert Patterson, who had observed that elephants were still being used for heavy transport in remote areas of Southeast Asia. If the military could create mechanical elephants with the same capabilities as real ones, but controlled by remote operators, they could solve the logistics problems that were hampering operations in dense jungle environments. General Dynamics was awarded a $15 million contract to develop prototype mechanical elephants capable of carrying 500-pound loads through jungle terrain while being controlled by radio from distances up to 5 miles away. The engineering challenges were enormous. The robots had to navigate through dense vegetation, cross rivers and streams, climb steep terrain and operate for days at a time without maintenance, all while maintaining radio contact with human controllers who might be miles away. The first prototypes, tested at Fort Benning in 1968, were impressive pieces of engineering, standing 8 feet tall and weighing nearly a ton. They could navigate through simulated jungle environments and carry loads that would require teams of human porters. The problems began when they were deployed to Vietnam. The first issue was that the robots were incredibly loud. The hydraulic systems, electric motors, and radio equipment produced a distinctive mechanical noise that could be heard from hundreds of meters away. In an environment where stealth was often critical, the mechanical elephants announced their presence to every enemy force in the area. Sergeant Michael Thompson, who was assigned to operate one of the prototype units, later recalled, "The thing sounded like a construction site having a nervous breakdown. You could hear it coming from a quarter-mile away, and it left a trail that a blind man could follow. It was like trying to do a stealth mission with a parade float." The second problem was reliability. The complex mechanical systems that worked perfectly in laboratory conditions broke down constantly in the harsh environment of the Vietnamese jungle. Moisture, heat, vegetation, and dirt clogged the mechanisms, shorted out the electronics, and caused frequent system failures. The third and most serious problem was that the Viet Cong found the mechanical elephants hilarious. Instead of being intimidated by the robot army, enemy forces began setting up ambushes specifically to capture or destroy the expensive machines. They discovered that the robots were vulnerable to simple improvised explosive devices, small arms fire, and even physical attacks using ropes and cables. Within 3 months of deployment, all 6 prototype mechanical elephants had been either destroyed or captured. The Viet Cong used parts from the captured robots to build better improvised weapons, while displaying elephant heads as trophies that mocked American technological pretension. The project was cancelled in late 1968, with all remaining prototypes being quietly shipped back to the United States for further development. The $15 million investment had produced exactly 0 operational advantages, while providing the enemy with both useful materials and propaganda victories. Chapter 5. The Flying Bicycle Corps. While engineers were building mechanical elephants, DARPA's Aerospace Division was working on an even more ambitious project: human-powered aircraft that could infiltrate enemy territory undetected. The concept was based on advances in lightweight materials and aerodynamic design that had made human-powered flight theoretically possible. If the military could develop aircraft powered entirely by human muscle, they could create reconnaissance platforms that were virtually silent, required no fuel, and could operate in areas where conventional aircraft would be detected by radar or audio surveillance. Boeing's Skunk Works division was awarded a classified contract to develop what became known as the Flying Bicycle, a ultra-lightweight aircraft that could be pedaled through the air like a bicycle on the ground. The engineering was genuinely revolutionary, using advanced composites, hollow frame construction, and aerodynamic designs that pushed the boundaries of known technology. Boeing created aircraft that weighed less than 150 pounds, but could carry a pilot and equipment through sustained flight. The prototypes were tested at a classified facility in Nevada, where experienced pilots demonstrated that human-powered flight was not only possible, but potentially practical for military application. The aircraft could fly at altitudes up to 500 feet, maintain speeds of 15 to 20 miles per hour, and operate for periods of up to 2 hours depending on pilot conditioning. Pentagon officials were excited by the potential. Here was a reconnaissance platform that was silent, virtually invisible to radar, required no fuel or maintenance, and could be operated by specially trained personnel who could be inserted anywhere in the world. The first combat deployment came in 1969 when a team of 6 flying bicycles was sent to Vietnam for operational testing. The reality of human-powered flight in a combat environment was considerably different from laboratory conditions. The first problem was physical conditioning. The pilots had to be in extraordinary physical shape to maintain flight for extended periods, but they also had to carry equipment, weapons and surveillance gear that added weight and reduced flight time. Most missions had to be aborted because pilots became exhausted before reaching their objectives. The second problem was weather sensitivity. The lightweight aircraft were extremely vulnerable to wind, rain and atmospheric turbulence that had no effect on conventional planes. Vietnam's tropical climate, with its sudden storms and unpredictable wind patterns, made flight operations virtually impossible. Captain Sarah Mitchell, one of the test pilots assigned to the program, later wrote, "Flying those things was like trying to ride a soap bubble through a hurricane. The slightest gust of wind would send you tumbling, and if you hit any kind of weather, you were going to crash. Period." The third problem was combat vulnerability. The aircraft were so lightly constructed that they could be brought down by small arms fire, slingshots, or even thrown objects. Pilots who were detected by enemy forces were essentially defenseless, flying in machines that couldn't outrun a man on foot, and offered no protection from any kind of attack. The program was cancelled after one of the flying bicycles was shot down by a Viet Cong fighter using a bamboo spear. The pilot survived the crash, but was captured and spent 2 years as a prisoner of war, while the aircraft itself was displayed in Hanoi as an example of American technological desperation. Chapter 6: Project Igloo White. The most expensive and technically sophisticated of America's strange weapons was Project Igloo White, an attempt to create an electronic fence along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, using thousands of remotely monitored sensors. The concept was the brainchild of Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, who believed that American technological superiority could be used to create an impenetrable barrier that would stop the flow of supplies from North Vietnam to Viet Cong forces in the south. The plan called for deploying over 20,000 electronic sensors along infiltration routes, connected to a centralized computer system that could track enemy movement in real time and direct airstrikes with unprecedented precision. The sensors themselves were marvels of miniaturization, disguised as vegetation or dropped from aircraft to resemble fallen branches. They could detect footsteps, vehicle movements, human voices, and even body heat from distances up to a. The data was transmitted to relay stations, then beamed to a command center where computers would analyze the information and identify enemy activity patterns. IBM was awarded the primary contract for the computer system, while various defense contractors developed different types of sensors: acoustic detectors that could identify human speech, seismic sensors that could distinguish between human footsteps and animal movement, chemical sensors that could detect vehicle exhaust and explosive. The total cost of the program was over $1.7 billion, equivalent to more than $10 billion in today's money. The first sensors were deployed in 1960. The initial results seemed promising. The system detected numerous movements,
and allowed airstrikes to be directed with what appeared to be devastating accuracy. The problem was that the North Vietnamese figured out the system almost immediately. Within weeks of the first deployments, enemy forces had identified the sensor locations and began an elaborate deception campaign. They used recordings of truck engines to trigger false alarms, placed speakers near sensors to simulate large troop movements, and even herded animals through detection zones to create meaningless data. More sophisticated countermeasures followed quickly. The North Vietnamese developed special units trained to locate and disable sensors, often replacing them with modified devices that transmitted false information back to the American command center. Colonel Nguyen Van Duc, who led the North Vietnamese counter-sensor operations, later wrote, "The Americans spent billions of dollars to build an electronic fence, but they forgot that we could hear their sensors just as well as their sensors could hear us. We turned their own system against them." The most devastating blow came when North Vietnamese engineers managed to capture several intact sensors and reverse engineer the communication protocols. This allowed them to inject false data directly into the American system, creating phantom enemy units and misdirecting airstrikes away from real targets. James Patterson, who worked on the computer analysis systems, later admitted, "By 1970, we estimate that at least 60% of the data coming from the sensors was either false or deliberately misleading. We were spending millions of dollars bombing empty jungle based on intelligence that was being manufactured by the enemy." The program was quietly cancelled in 1971, with officials claiming that the electronic fence had achieved its strategic objective. In reality, it had consumed enormous resources while providing virtually no tactical advantages, and had actually helped enemy forces by giving them detailed information about American intelligence gathering method. Chapter 7: The Weather Warriors. Perhaps the most ambitious of all American secret weapons programs was Operation Popeye, an attempt to control the weather over Southeast Asia to extend the monsoon season and disrupt enemy supply lines. The concept was based on cloud seeding technology that had been developed for civilian weather modification projects. If scientists could artificially increase rainfall over the Ho Chi Minh Trail during critical supply periods, they could make the routes impassable for months at a time without using conventional weapons. The Air Force Weather Service partnered with civilian research institutions to develop techniques for large-scale weather modification. The basic approach involved seeding clouds with silver iodide particles to trigger precipitation, but the scale of the operation was unprecedented. Between 1967 and 1972, American aircraft flew over 2,600 cloud seeding missions over Southeast Asia, dispersing millions of pounds of silver iodide and other compounds designed to enhance rainfall. The program was so secret that most of the pilots flying the missions didn't know what they were doing. They were told they were conducting atmospheric research and were given strict orders not to discuss their activities with anyone, including other Air Force personnel. Major Robert Harrison, who flew 47 weather modification missions, later said, "We knew we were doing something unusual, but we thought it was some kind of scientific experiment. We didn't realize we were trying to weaponize the weather until years later when the program was declassified." The initial results seemed impressive. Rainfall over targeted areas did increase significantly during several monsoon seasons, and intelligence reports suggested that enemy supply operations were being disrupted by unusually severe weather. But the long-term consequences were disastrous. The weather modification operations affected rainfall patterns across the entire region, not just over target areas. This led to severe droughts in some areas and devastating floods in others, causing civilian casualties and agricultural disasters that affected millions of people.
More seriously, the atmospheric modifications had unpredictable side effects that weren't fully understood until decades later. The large-scale introduction of silver iodide and other compounds into the atmosphere may have contributed to changes in regional weather patterns that persisted long after the program ended. Dr. Margaret Chen, a meteorologist who studied the long-term effects of the weather modification program, concluded Operation Popeye may have been one of the first examples of anthropogenic climate change on a regional scale. The atmospheric modifications affected weather patterns across Southeast Asia for years, possibly decades, after the program ended. The program was exposed by investigative journalists in 1972, leading to congressional hearings and international condemnation. The revelation that the United States had been secretly attempting to weaponize the weather led to the Environmental Modification Convention of 1977, which banned the military use of weather modification technologies. The total cost of Operation Popeye was never officially disclosed, but estimates suggest it exceeded $500 million, while achieving no measurable military objectives. Chapter 8: The Crossbow Conspiracy. While high-tech weapons programs consumed billions of dollars, some American commanders decided that the solution to Vietnam's challenges might be found by going in the opposite direction, abandoning modern technology entirely in favor of primitive weapons that the enemy wouldn't expect. This philosophy led to Project Spike, the development of advanced crossbows for special operations forces. The concept was championed by Colonel William Morrison, a special forces commander, who argued that primitive weapons offered significant advantages in jungle warfare. They were silent, required no ammunition supply lines, could be manufactured using local materials, and were so unexpected that enemy forces wouldn't have developed countermeasures. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency was surprisingly receptive to the idea. In an era when every other weapons program involved complex electronics and exotic materials, the simplicity of advanced crossbows was almost revolutionary. A classified contract was awarded to a consortium of sporting goods manufacturers and aerospace engineers to develop crossbows that combined primitive mechanics with advanced materials and engineering. The results were impressive pieces of technology using carbon fiber construction, precision machined components, and advanced optical sights. The military crossbows could accurately deliver explosive-tipped arrows at ranges up to 200 meters. The arrows themselves were marvels of miniaturization. Weighing less than standard crossbow bolts, they carried small explosive charges that could penetrate light armor and create devastating wounds. Some variants included chemical agents, incendiary compounds, or even miniature electronic devices for marking targets. The first field tests were conducted by Green Beret units, operating in areas where conventional weapons noise would compromise mission security. Initial reports were enthusiastic. The crossbows were indeed silent, accurate, and deadly. Captain James Rodriguez, who led one of the test units, later wrote, "The crossbows worked exactly as advertised, silent, accurate, and absolutely devastating. We could take out sentries, eliminate targets, and conduct operations without anyone knowing we were there." For about 2 weeks we thought we had found the perfect weapon. The problems began when enemy forces captured several crossbows and began reverse engineering the technology. Unlike complex electronic systems that required sophisticated manufacturing capabilities, crossbows could be replicated using relatively simple tools and materials. Within months, Viet Cong forces had developed their own versions of the American crossbows, often improving on the original design. Worse, the enemy began using the crossbows against American forces, with devastating effect. The psychological impact of being attacked with primitive weapons was particularly demoralizing for soldiers who had expected to fight a technological war using advanced equipment. Sergeant Michael Thompson later recalled, "Getting shot at with arrows was somehow worse than getting shot at with bullets. It felt like we were fighting in the Middle Ages instead of the 20th century. Plus, arrows don't make noise when they're fired, so you never heard them come." The program was cancelled after 6 months, when it became clear that the crossbows were causing more casualties among American forces than among the enemy. The final straw came when a Green Beret unit was ambushed by Viet Cong fighters, using American-designed crossbows that had been captured and Chapter 9: The Riot Control Catastrophe. One of the most controversial weapons programs involved the development of non-lethal chemical agents, designed to incapacitate enemy forces without causing permanent harm. The concept was based on advances in riot control technology that had been developed for law enforcement use. If police could use chemical agents to control civilian crowds without causing fatalities, military forces could theoretically use similar compounds to neutralize enemy soldiers while minimizing casualty. The Army Chemical Corps developed several compounds based on tear gas,
but enhanced to be more effective in outdoor environments and against trained soldiers wearing protective equipment. The primary agent, designated CS2, was designed to cause temporary incapacitation through intense irritation of the eyes, nose, throat, and respiratory system. Unlike standard tear gas, CS2 was persistent in the environment and could penetrate most protective equipment. Field testing began in 1968, with CS2 being deployed against suspected enemy positions using artillery shells and aircraft delivery system. The theory was that enemy forces would be incapacitated by the chemical agent, allowing American forces to capture positions with minimal casualties on both sides. The reality was considerably different. The first problem was that CS2 was much more dangerous than advertised. In confined spaces like bunkers and tunnels, concentrations of the agent could cause severe chemical burns, permanent lung damage, and even death. Several American soldiers were seriously injured when they entered areas that had been treated with CS2 without adequate protective equipment. The second problem was environmental persistence. CS2 remained active in the environment for weeks or months after deployment, contaminating water supplies and agricultural areas. This led to civilian casualties and long-term health problems for local populations. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Army Chemical Corps researcher who worked on CS2 development, later testified before Congress. "We designed CS2 to be non-lethal, but we didn't fully understand the environmental and health consequences. In retrospect, it was more dangerous than many conventional weapons." The third problem was that the Viet Cong developed effective countermeasures almost immediately. Simple protective equipment, wet cloth over the nose and mouth, improvised gas masks made from plastic bags and charcoal was sufficient to neutralize the effects of. More seriously, the enemy began capturing CS2 delivery systems and using them against American forces. Several American positions were overrun after being attacked with their own chemical weapon. The program was cancelled in 1970 following congressional hearings that revealed the extent of civilian casualties and environmental damage. The use of chemical weapons in Vietnam became a major international controversy that damaged American credibility and led to strengthened international laws governing chemical warfare. Chapter 10. The Sound and Fury. Another bizarre weapons program focused on using sound as a weapon, developing acoustic systems that could incapacitate, disorient, or terrify enemy forces. The concept was based on research into the psychological and physiological effects of sound. Certain frequencies could cause nausea, disorientation, or panic in human beings. If these effects could be weaponized, American forces could control enemy behavior without using conventional weapons. The Navy's Acoustic Research Laboratory developed several prototype sound weapons, infrasonic generators that produced frequencies below the range of human hearing, but could cause physical discomfort, ultrasonic weapons that could cause hearing damage and disorient, and psychological warfare speakers that could project threatening sounds over long distances. The most ambitious project was codenamed Sound of Thunder, a truck-mounted system that could generate sound levels of over 150 decibels across a range of frequencies. In laboratory tests, the acoustic weapons proved capable of causing significant physiological effects. Test subjects exposed to the systems experienced nausea, disorientation, temporary hearing loss, and in some cases panic attack. The first field deployment came in 1969 when a Sound of Thunder system was used against a suspected enemy camp. The results were initially encouraging. Intelligence reports suggested that the position had been abandoned immediately after the acoustic attack. However, follow-up investigation revealed that the camp had been abandoned before the attack took place, and that the sound weapons had only succeeded in announcing American intentions to every enemy force within a 10-mile radius. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, who commanded the acoustic weapons unit, later wrote, "The problem with sound weapons is that sound travels in all directions. You can't point sound at the enemy without also pointing it at yourself and everyone else in the area." This fundamental limitation made acoustic weapons almost useless in combat. They were too indiscriminate to use near friendly forces, too loud to use in stealth operations, and too obvious to use in any situation where surprise was important. The program was cancelled after it was determined that the acoustic weapons were more effective against American forces than against the enemy. Several American units had been forced to evacuate positions because their own sound weapons had made the areas uninhabitable. Chapter 11. The Instant Bridge Debacle. One of the most expensive failures involved an attempt to solve the logistics problems caused by destroyed bridges and impassable rivers. The concept was simple: develop a system that could instantly create temporary bridges across water obstacles, allowing American forces to maintain mobility even when conventional routes were blocked. The solution was the pneumatic bridge system, a series of inflatable pontoons that could be rapidly deployed across rivers and streams to create temporary crossings, capable of supporting vehicles and heavy equipment. The engineering was genuinely innovative. The pontoons were made from advanced composite materials that were lightweight when deflated, but incredibly strong when inflated.
The system could theoretically create a 100-meter bridge in less than 30 minutes using portable compressors and inflation equipment. Initial tests at Fort de Lavaux were successful. The pneumatic bridges could indeed support the weight of tanks and heavy vehicles while being deployed and recovered quickly by small engineering teams. The first combat deployment came in late 1968, when a pneumatic bridge system was used to cross a river during a search and destroy operation. The problems began immediately. The first issue was that the inflatable pontoons were extremely vulnerable to enemy fire. A single bullet hole could deflate an entire pontoon in seconds, causing the bridge to collapse and dumping vehicles and personnel into the water. The second problem was that the inflation equipment was loud, complex, and frequently broke down under field conditions. The portable compressors required constant maintenance and were vulnerable to moisture, dirt, and mechanical shock. Captain Michael Rodriguez, who was responsible for deploying the pneumatic bridges, later recalled, "The pontoons worked great until someone shot at them. Then you'd have this expensive piece of equipment deflating like a punctured balloon, while tanks were trying to cross it. It was a disaster waiting to happen." The third problem was that the Viet Cong quickly learned to target the bridges with improvised explosives, turning each crossing operation into a complex engineering project that required extensive security and preparation. The final straw came when an entire pneumatic bridge system was destroyed by a single Viet Cong fighter, using a bamboo spear to puncture the pontoons. The $3 million bridge system was rendered useless by a weapon that cost less than $1 to make. The program was cancelled in early 1969, with all remaining systems being shipped back to the United States for further development. The military returned to using conventional bridge building techniques that were slower but considerably more reliable. Chapter 12: The Psychology of Failure. The failure of America's strange weapons wasn't just about technical problems or enemy countermeasures. It was about the psychology of innovation under pressure. Dr. Robert Patterson, a Pentagon consultant who evaluated many of the failed weapons programs, later wrote, "The problem wasn't that American scientists and engineers weren't brilliant. The problem was that they were asked to solve military problems without understanding the military context. The weapons development process had become isolated from the realities of combat. Scientists worked in laboratories under controlled conditions, developing systems that performed perfectly in artificial environments, but failed catastrophically when exposed to the chaos, uncertainty, and improvisation of actual warfare." More fundamentally, the strange weapons programs reflected a uniquely American faith in technological solutions to complex problems. Instead of adapting tactics and strategies to the unique challenges of Vietnam, American commanders sought technological shortcuts that would allow them to fight the war they wanted to fight, rather than the war they were actually in. This technological optimism blinded decision-makers to the fundamental limitations of advanced systems in guerrilla warfare. Complex weapons required complex support systems, extensive training, and predictable operating environments, none of which were available in the Vietnamese jungle. The enemy, meanwhile, fought with simple weapons that were reliable, repairable, and suited to local conditions. AK-47 rifles, improvised explosives, and bamboo spears might not have been as sophisticated as American wonder weapons, but they worked when they needed to work. The psychological impact on American forces was devastating. Soldiers who had been promised technological superiority found themselves outfought by an enemy using primitive weapons and basic tactics. The failure of advanced systems undermined confidence in American equipment and doctrine. Sergeant James Thompson, who served with units that used several of the failed weapons systems, later said, "After a while, we stopped trusting anything that came from the Pentagon scientists. If they told us a weapon was revolutionary, we figured it would probably get us killed. We learned to stick with the basic stuff that we knew would work." Epilogue: Lessons in Lunacy. The strange weapons of Vietnam represented one of the most expensive and comprehensive failures in military history. Conservative estimates suggest that over $10 billion was spent on weapons programs that provided no tactical advantages while creating numerous operational problems. But the failure wasn't just financial, it was philosophical. The strange weapons programs revealed fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of warfare, the relationship between technology and tactics, and the importance of adapting to local conditions rather than trying to impose technological solutions. The lessons learned from these failures influenced military development for decades. Modern weapons programs emphasize reliability over innovation, field testing over laboratory performance, and incremental improvement over revolutionary breakthrough. More importantly, the Vietnam experience taught military planners that the most sophisticated weapon is useless if it can't be maintained, operated, and supported under combat conditions. This led to the development of ruggedized systems designed to function in hostile environments with minimal support. The strange weapons of Vietnam also demonstrated the importance of understanding the enemy. American scientists developed systems based on assumptions about how the war would be fought, without fully understanding how the enemy actually operated. This led to weapons that solved problems that didn't exist while ignoring problems that did. Perhaps most significantly, the failure of technological solutions in Vietnam led to a renewed emphasis on human factors in military operations. No weapon, no matter how advanced, could substitute for well-trained soldiers, effective leadership, and sound tactical doctrine. Today, remnants of these failed weapons programs can be found in museums and classified archives around the world. They serve as reminders that innovation without understanding, technology without wisdom, and solutions without problems are recipes for expensive failure. The strangest aspect of America's strange weapons may be that they were developed by some of the brightest minds in the country, using unlimited resources and the most advanced technology available. Yet they failed not because the science was wrong, but because the premises were wrong. In the end, the Vietnamese jungle proved that complexity was no match for simplicity, sophistication was no substitute for reliability, and that the most advanced weapon was still just a tool in the hands of human beings. The war was won not by the side with the strangest weapons, but by the side that best understood how to use simple weapons effectively. And that perhaps is the strangest lesson of all.